The Baccarat crystal champagne flute felt like a shard of ice in my hand, a foreign object from a world I was only ever allowed to visit under supervision. Across the vast, polished expanse of the mahogany dining table, my family was a living portrait of dynastic success, framed by the dim, ancestral light of the Sterling Manor. My father, Richard Sterling, the imperious CEO of Sterling Innovations, stood, his portly frame exuding a satisfaction so potent it seemed to suck the oxygen from the room. A toast! He boomed, his voice, accustomed to commanding boardrooms, echoing off the high, coffered ceilings. To my daughter, Clara. He beamed at my sister, his gaze filled with a proprietary pride that he had never once directed at me. The new vice president of operations, at a mere 26. She is, in every sense of the word, a true Sterling. My mother, Eleanor, the company's impeccably groomed and emotionally distant CFO, added her assent with a regal nod. She has her father's formidable business acumen. It's a gift, you see. Not everyone is so blessed. Her eyes, the color of a winter sky, flickered toward me for a microsecond. It wasn't a glance so much as a dismissal, a tiny pinpoint dart of disdain that carried the accumulated weight of 2 decades of disappointment. My older sister Clara positively preened. Seated to my father's right, she was the sun around which our family's universe orbited. Her blonde hair, the color of spun gold, was swept into a flawless chignon. Her sapphire dress, a recent acquisition from a shopping trip to Milan, shimmered under the heavy light of the chandelier. She was everything they valued, and, by extension, everything I was not. Poised, polished, and possessing a casual cruelty she mistook for strength. "Thank you, Daddy." "Mummy," she said, her voice a smooth, practiced melody. "I promise I won't let you down. I will dedicate myself to securing the Sterling legacy for the next generation." They all drank. The clinking of their glasses was a sound of smug finality, a symphony of self-congratulation. I just held my flute, the champagne within. A vintage Dom Perignon, no doubt. A flat, pale gold. My presence here was a non-negotiable command performance. I was a necessary prop, the family's resident failure, the dark, uninteresting backdrop required to make Clara's brilliance truly pop. I was the before picture in their family's triumphant after. After a few moments of basking in their shared glory, my father's attention inevitably and unpleasantly turned to me. "And what about you, Anya?" he asked, the question a familiar opening salvo in a war I never won. His face was set in its usual lines of weary disappointment. "Still at that little coffee shop? Still tinkering with your numbers?" He said the word numbers as if it were something distasteful he had just scraped off the sole of his bespoke leather shoe. "I have a job, Dad," I said, my voice carefully neutral, betraying none of the acid churning in my stomach. "I'm a junior data analyst at a small financial services firm." He waved a dismissive, manicured hand, a gesture that erased my entire professional life in an instant. "Data entry. A secretary with a more modern title. Honestly, Anya, I will never understand it. We offered you a position, a real career, at Sterling Innovations. We offered you a place in your own family's legacy. And you threw it all away to play with spreadsheets for what I can only assume is a pittance." The injustice of his words was a physical blow. "You offered me an internship in the mailroom," I clarified, my voice quiet but laced with a cold fury only I could hear. My grip tightened on the delicate stem of the glass, and for a wild second, I imagined shattering it in my fist. "You offered me that after you flatly refused to contribute a single dollar to my university tuition. Because you wanted to study theoretical mathematics," Eleanor chimed in, her voice as sharp and cutting as the diamonds at her throat. "An utterly pointless, abstract indulgence. We were not going to squander the family's resources funding your little hobbies, Anya. Your sister understood that. Clara went to Wharton. She made a practical, intelligent choice. And look at her now." Clara gave me a smile that was pure poison wrapped in pity. It was her signature move, the condescending tilt of her lips that made me feel like an insect. "It's all right, Anya. Not everyone is cut out for the pressures of the real world. We can't all be leaders. Someone has to pour the coffee." At that exact moment, a silent, discreet vibration emanated from the cheap 3-year-old smartphone tucked in my lap. I'd set the alert to be haptic only. On its cracked screen was a notification from my encrypted brokerage platform. It was a simple message, but it sent a jolt of triumphant electric warmth through my entire body. A heat that had nothing to do with the roaring fire in the grand marble hearth. While they sat there toasting Clara's token promotion in a company built on nepotism, the FDA had just granted final approval to a revolutionary gene therapy treatment developed by a small biotech firm I had sunk nearly 40% of my portfolio into 6 months ago. It was a high-risk, high-reward play, one I'd spent hundreds of hours researching. At market open tomorrow, the stock was projected to surge by at least 400%, potentially more. They were celebrating a title. I was celebrating the creation of a fortune that would soon dwarf their own. They looked at me and saw a data entry clerk who smelled faintly of burnt coffee. They had no idea they were sitting across from their single largest and most dangerous anonymous investor. They were toasting the continued success of a company that was already bleeding, a slow, steady hemorrhage of debt and mismanagement they were too arrogant to see. And I was the one who had just spent the last quarter quietly buying up the controlling interest in the debt they owed to their creditors. They thought they were the masters of this gilded universe. The truth was, they were already living in mine. I just hadn't served the eviction notice yet. My entire life has been a relentless exercise in comparison, and I was always the lesser half of the Sterling equation. Clara was the sun, a blazing star of charisma and ambition. I was the cold, distant moon, only visible in her reflected light. It was a dynamic established so early I have no memories preceding it. When she was cast as the princess in the second-grade play, her natural stage presence lauded by all, I was praised for my quiet focus in painting the cardboard castle backdrop. When her photograph appeared in the local paper, a blue ribbon pinned to her equestrian jacket, as she sat atop a polished thoroughbred, my victory in the statewide math Olympiad was acknowledged with a brief, "That's nice, dear," before the conversation turned back to the cost of stable fees. Everything in our house, a sprawling, joyless mansion that felt more like a corporate headquarters than a home, revolved around Sterling Innovations. It wasn't just a business, it was a religion. Founded by my great-grandfather, expanded by my grandfather, and now captained by my father, it was a dynasty built on the manufacturing of high-end industrial components. Dinner conversations were not about our days at school, but about production figures, market share percentages, and strategic acquisitions. My father spoke of quarterly earnings reports with a reverence other men reserved for scripture. Clara, ever the acolyte, absorbed it all. She would parrot his opinions on supply chain logistics and dazzle him with her ruthless, corporate-minded worldview. I, on the other hand, was an apostate. I found the endless talk of profit margins and hostile takeovers profoundly, soul-crushingly boring. My fascination lay not in the application of capital, but in the abstract systems beneath the surface of everything. I saw the hidden beauty in prime numbers, the sublime elegance in a perfectly structured algorithm. To my family, this was not a sign of intelligence, but a bizarre and worrisome eccentricity. A character flaw that needed to be managed, like a stutter or a limp. The final, irreparable schism occurred in the spring of my senior year of high school. Against all odds and with no help from my family, I had been granted early admission to the University of Chicago's renowned mathematics program. It wasn't just an acceptance letter. It was a lifeline, a notarized promise of escape. It was my chance to finally exist in a place where my way of thinking was not a bug, but a feature. I remember presenting the thick, official envelope to my parents at dinner, my hands trembling with a mixture of excitement and dread. My father took the letter, his expression one of profound disinterest. He scanned the first paragraph, his lip curling slightly. "Mathematics?" he scoffed, dropping it onto the table as if it were contaminated. "What on earth are you going to do with a degree in mathematics? Become a high school teacher?" "I could go into cryptography," I argued, my voice small but desperate. "Quantitative analysis, aerospace engineering, theoretical physics, the applications are endless." "Pointless," my mother interjected, her voice smooth and cold as marble. "They are intellectual fantasies, Anya, not careers. Your sister has been accepted to Wharton. She will get her MBA, and then she will come home and take her rightful place at the company. That is a real plan. You should follow her example. Go to the local community college, get a simple degree in business administration. We will find a menial but useful place for you. Everyone in this family must be useful. The room suddenly felt airless. I stared at them, the full, crushing weight of their decision settling upon me. You'll pay over $250,000 for Clara to go to Wharton, but you won't pay for me to go to my dream school? Wharton is an investment in the future of this family, my father said, his tone leaving no room for appeal. Your math degree is a frivolous expense. We are not paying for it. And that was it. The door to the life I had imagined for myself was slammed shut and bolted. Clara departed for her Ivy League adventure that fall, armed with a limitless American Express card and the full, unwavering support of our parents. I stayed home, a ghost in my own childhood house, enrolled in a community college business program that felt like a punishment. Their financial control became absolute. The meager allowance they provided was contingent on maintaining a B average in classes I despised and demonstrating a sufficiently deferential attitude at all times. Every dollar was a link in a chain, a constant reminder of my dependence. The anger and despair were a constant, simmering poison in my veins. But beneath it, something else began to take root, something hard and sharp and resilient. If they would not invest in me, then I would have to become my own investor. I found a part-time job at a dingy 24-hour coffee shop on the edge of town, the very one my father so enjoyed mocking me about. The work was grueling, a blur of steam wands, sticky counters, and rude customers. The pay was abysmal, but it was mine. Every crumpled dollar bill I smoothed out and placed in my wallet felt like a small, hard-won piece of my own soul. I began to live a life of radical monastic frugality. I ate instant noodles and day-old pastries from work. I bought my clothes at thrift stores. I never went out. My social life withered and died, and I didn't care. Every spare penny, every single cent that didn't go to my barest survival was saved. While my classmates were out drinking and dating, I was in the back corner of the municipal library, not studying the marketing textbooks I was supposed to be reading, but devouring everything I could find on macroeconomics, options trading, and corporate finance. Online, I fell down the rabbit hole of quantitative analysis, teaching myself Python and SQL, building rudimentary algorithms to scrape financial data and analyze market trends. And I discovered something extraordinary. I had a gift. It was an intuitive, almost preternatural grasp of the intricate dance of the market. I could see the patterns in the chaos, the faint signals in the deafening noise. It felt less like learning a skill and more like awakening a dormant sense. The abstract world of numbers I had always loved was not abstract at all. It was the hidden architecture of power, and I was finally learning to read the blueprints. My first investment was $200, painstakingly saved over 6 months of pouring coffee and cleaning toilets. I put it all into a small, obscure tech startup that had developed a new data compression algorithm. My family would have laughed at the paltry sum, the sheer insignificance of it. But I had read their white paper a dozen times, I had analyzed the professional histories of their engineers, and my own simple algorithm had flagged their stock as deeply undervalued. 3 months later, they were acquired by a tech giant in a surprise deal, and my $200 became $5,000. I didn't cash out and buy a new car or clothes. I reinvested every single cent. My secret portfolio became my singular obsession. It was my real education, my silent, all-consuming rebellion. In the real world, I was Anya Sterling, the disappointing daughter, the listless community college student, the girl who poured coffee. But in the digital world of my brokerage account, I was becoming someone else entirely. I was becoming powerful. The numbers on the screen were my validation. They were the objective, irrefutable proof that I wasn't the person my family said I was. I wasn't a liability. I was a phenomenally successful, completely anonymous asset. And soon, very soon, I would be the one determining their value. The night of Clara's promotion dinner was the crucible in which my passive resentment was forged into the cold, hard steel of purpose. I drove home to my tiny, threadbare apartment, the echoes of their condescending laughter still ringing in my ears. Someone has to pour the coffee. The words weren't just an insult, they were my family's entire thesis on my life's potential. They had written my story for me, and in it, I was destined to be a footnote. I didn't turn on the lights. I sat in the dark, the spectral glow of my triple monitor setup casting long shadows across the Spartan room. On the central screen, my brokerage account displayed its current value, the numbers a beautiful, triumphant green. On the right screen, a series of complex algorithms I'd designed were actively scraping and analyzing real-time market data. And on the left, I pulled up the public financial records for Sterling Innovations. For years, I had been a passive receptacle for their dinner table shop talk. I knew their suppliers, their competitors, their quarterly anxieties. But now, for the first time, I looked at the company not as a daughter, but as a predator. And what I saw was a target ripe for the taking. I saw a company coasting on the fumes of its past glory. My father's leadership style was stagnant, a relic of the 1990s. He relied on handshake deals and a brand name that was steadily losing its luster in a globalized, more efficient market. My mother's financial reports, which I now analyzed with a forensic eye, were masterpieces of creative accounting. She was an expert at shuffling liabilities and inflating asset values to paint a far rosier picture than reality. And Clara, for all her Wharton-honed ambition, was a liability. I dug into the data surrounding the disastrous European expansion she had spearheaded a year prior. They had written it off as a market downturn, but the numbers told a different story. A story of poor research, arrogant decision-making, and a catastrophic misunderstanding of the target demographic. It was a $70 million blunder that had been quietly buried. They saw Sterling Innovations as a fortress. I saw a poorly maintained facade, with deep structural cracks in the foundation. I saw the bloated executive salaries, the refusal to invest in new technology, the over-reliance on a few aging clients, and, most importantly, the staggering amount of corporate debt they had taken on to fund my father's vanity projects and Clara's failed expansion. A cold, clear purpose crystallized in my mind, as sharp and perfect as a diamond. It was no longer enough to simply become successful on my own. It was no longer enough to walk away and build a life of quiet luxury. That would be a private victory, and the wounds they had inflicted upon me had been public, administered over years of casual, consistent cruelty. They needed to understand, in a way they could not ignore or dismiss, the exact nature of the asset they had so carelessly thrown away. Their entire identities, their sense of self-worth, their social standing, it was all built on two pillars: the success of their company and the perfection of their chosen daughter. I decided in that moment that I was going to take both of those pillars away from them. I would use the very skills they had belittled and dismissed to meticulously, systematically dismantle the empire they so cherished. The plan was audacious, almost laughably so. But the numbers backed it up. I would use my now considerable fortune to acquire a controlling interest in Sterling Innovations. But I would not do it as Anya Sterling. Anya Sterling in their world was a ghost, a failure. So a ghost I would become. I would operate from the deepest shadows of international finance, a phantom investor moving through a labyrinth of shell corporations and anonymous holding companies. I would become the majority shareholder, and they would never see me coming. The first concrete step was to legitimize my operation. The next morning, I contacted a highly respected and highly discreet law firm specializing in corporate structuring. Over a series of encrypted video calls, I laid out my requirements. I needed a holding company, one that would serve as the nerve center for my activities. Sitting in my cramped apartment, I signed the digital paperwork that brought into existence Nemesis Capital Management. It felt perfect. Through Nemesis, my legal team established 3 distinct shell corporations, each a separate legal entity registered in a different jurisdiction known for its impenetrable corporate privacy laws, one in Delaware, one in the Cayman Islands, and one in Switzerland. These entities would be the public face of the acquisition, making it nearly impossible for anyone to trace the purchases back to a single source, let alone to a data analyst who officially earned $38,000 a year. This wasn't just a revenge plot. It was the final, brutal exam for the education I had given myself. I would use the tools of their world, capital, leverage, and information, as the weapons of their destruction. The irony was a pleasure so deep, It was almost physical. The game had begun. The first phase of the assault was silent and invisible. It targeted the company's greatest vulnerability, its debt. Under my father's aggressive, some might say reckless leadership, Sterling Innovations was far more leveraged than the public or even most of the board understood. He saw debt as a tool for growth. I saw it as a collar waiting for a leash. Using my Swiss entity, I began buying up that debt from the secondary lenders and investment banks that held it. It was a complex, painstaking process, but piece by piece, I became their primary creditor. The quarterly interest payments they made, money siphoned from the company to service their poor decisions, now flowed indirectly into the coffers of Nemesis Capital. They were, in effect, paying me to plan their demise. Simultaneously, I began the slow, methodical acquisition of their stock. Sterling Innovations was a publicly traded company, but the family and their closest allies held a significant plurality of the shares, around 42%. They had grown complacent, nestled in the security of believing that no single entity would ever challenge their control. They were wrong. Through my Delaware and Cayman Islands corporations, I moved like a shark in deep water, never buying enough at one time to trigger SEC disclosure requirements or alert their trading algorithms. My purchases were 1,000 tiny, insignificant bites, bleeding them of ownership so gradually they didn't even feel the wound. I bought shares on the open market. I bought a large block from a retired executive who had been unceremoniously pushed out by my father years earlier and still harbored a grudge. I bought from a pension fund whose managers were growing weary of the company's stagnant performance and my father's refusal to modernize. Each transaction was a quiet, deliberate move on a chessboard only I could see. Meanwhile, my life continued its bizarre duality. I still worked my data analyst job, still lived in my Spartan apartment, and still attended the mandatory Sunday dinners at the Sterling Manor. This charade was my greatest camouflage. I would sit at their table, nursing a glass of water while they unknowingly discussed my actions. "The trading volume has been unusually high this quarter," my father would grumble, swirling the amber liquid in his scotch glass. "But the price is staying flat. It makes no sense. Must be day traders and algorithms mucking things up." I would nod meekly, offering a bland, "The market is so confusing," while mentally calculating the precise percentage of his company I had acquired that week. Clara, ever eager to prove her worth as the new VP of Operations, had a different theory. She was convinced a corporate rival was making a move. "It's Titan Corp," she insisted one evening, naming their chief competitor. "I can feel it. They're trying to soften us up for a hostile takeover. It's the only logical explanation for this pattern of trading. Dad, we need to consider a poison pill strategy. Or, at the very least, issue new shares to dilute the holdings of any potential aggressor." I had to physically clench my jaw to keep from laughing out loud. Her brilliant defensive strategy was a godsend. Diluting the shares would drop the price, allowing me to acquire even more, even faster, and at a discount. "An excellent thought, darling," my father praised, beaming at her. "Proactive and aggressive. See, Eleanor, this is why she's a true Sterling." 2 weeks later, they announced the new share offering. The stock price predictably dipped by 7%. I instructed my brokers, funded by the massive windfall from my biotech investment, to buy every single share. By the end of that week, my stake in Sterling Innovations had crossed the 30% threshold. The shark was no longer circling. It was beginning to close in. With a substantial beachhead of ownership established, I pivoted to the second phase of my plan: psychological warfare. My intimate knowledge of their personalities, my father's explosive pride, my mother's obsession with appearances, Clara's deep-seated insecurity masked by arrogance, was my most potent weapon. I began by leaking carefully curated, anonymous tips to influential financial journalists and bloggers. I used encrypted emails and burner phones, creating a digital ghost that was impossible to trace. The first leak was a seemingly innocuous piece about the true, unaudited cost of Clara's failed European expansion, framing it as a case study in nepotism. The article, published on a popular financial news site, didn't name her, but anyone in the industry knew exactly who it was about. At Sunday dinner that week, Clara was incandescent with rage. "Someone from the inside must have leaked this," It's a smear campaign. Daddy, you have to find them and fire them. Sue them. My father, his face grim, promised a full investigation. The seeds of paranoia had been planted. The next leak, a month later, was a more technical piece questioning the age and efficiency of Sterling Innovation's core manufacturing equipment, complete with specific data points on maintenance costs and production downtime that I had gleaned from years of listening to my father complain at the dinner table. The article suggested the company was on the verge of obsolescence, a dinosaur ignoring the asteroid. This time, the market reacted. The stock price dipped by another 4%. Panic began to set in. My father became a tyrant at the office, his legendary temper flaring at the slightest provocation. He was convinced there was a traitor in his senior management team. My mother spent her days in frantic, hushed conversations with their lawyers, trying to figure out who was behind the anonymous stock purchases. And Clara, completely out of her depth, responded with pure hubris. She personally authorized a press release that was a masterpiece of condescending denial, dismissing the articles as the jealous ramblings of smaller minds who cannot comprehend our long-term vision. The release was widely mocked for its arrogance, and the stock fell another point. They were so busy fighting shadows, so consumed with finding an external enemy. They never once glanced at the quiet girl sitting at their table, the one they had ignored and dismissed her entire life. They were searching the corporate world for a monster, a rival CEO, a ruthless corporate raider in a pinstripe suit. They never suspected that the monster was their own daughter, wearing a 5-year-old sweater and plotting their demise from a laptop in a rundown apartment. By the 1-year anniversary of that fateful dinner, I had done it. Between Nemesis Capital and its 3 shell corporations, my ownership stake now stood at a commanding 51%. I was the silent, invisible majority shareholder. I owned them. Their company, their legacy, their name, their future. It was all mine to do with as I pleased. It was time to pull back the curtain. My lawyers, acting on behalf of the now consolidated holding companies, formally submitted a letter to the board of Sterling Innovations. It was a cold, brutally efficient document requesting an emergency meeting of the board of directors. The agenda was short and simple: a vote of no confidence in the chief executive officer, the chief financial officer, and the vice president of operations, and a motion for their immediate removal. The day of the board meeting dawned gray and oppressive, a low, bruised-looking sky hanging over the city. I felt a strange, calm detachment, like a surgeon before a complex operation. I didn't go to the gleaming Sterling Tower downtown. Instead, I sat in my new office, a minimalist, glass-walled space on the 50th floor of a rival building. It was the official headquarters of Nemesis Capital, a world away from the cramped apartment I had called home for so long. On a large 8K monitor that took up most of one wall, a secure video feed showed the live interior of the Sterling Innovations boardroom. It was exactly as I remembered it from the few times I had been summoned there as a child, a stage for some parental lecture. The long, intimidatingly polished mahogany table reflected the grim faces like a dark mirror. The stern, oil-painted portraits of my grandfather and great-grandfather stared down from the walls, their expressions seemingly more judgmental than usual. The very air seemed thick, with the scent of old money, leather, and impending doom. The board members, mostly old family friends and cronies of my father, who owed their comfortable positions to his patronage, were shifting uncomfortably in their high-backed leather chairs. They murmured to each other in hushed, worried tones. Then, my family entered. They walked in as a united front, but their facade of confidence was paper-thin. My father's face was pale and tight, his usual boisterous energy replaced by a brittle, defensive tension. My mother's expression was a perfect mask of strained composure, but her white-knuckled grip on the leather portfolio in front of her betrayed her inner turmoil. And Clara looked like a cornered animal. Her arrogance had curdled into something ugly and fearful. They took their seats at the head of the table, the seats they had always believed were theirs by divine right. At precisely 10 a.m., the large screen at the far end of the boardroom flickered to life. The face that appeared was that of Mr. Davies, my lead attorney, a sharp, silver-haired man from a London firm whose expression was one of polite, professional ruthlessness. "Good morning, members of the board," he began, his voice calm and clear, cutting through the tense silence. "We are here today because my client, the new majority shareholder of Sterling Innovations, has lost all faith in the current executive leadership." My father started to rise from his chair, his face flushing with anger. "Now see here. Who is your client? Who do you think you are calling this meeting?" Davies completely ignored him, his eyes remaining fixed on the camera. Under the tenure of CEO Richard Sterling, the company has seen its market share decline by a staggering 18% over the last 5 years. Its debt-to-equity ratio has ballooned to an unsustainable level, and it has consistently failed to innovate or adapt to a changing global marketplace. He paused, then continued, his tone unwavering. Under CFO Eleanor Sterling, quarterly reports have consistently obscured significant financial weaknesses through accounting practices that are, to put it charitably, ambiguous and misleading to shareholders. He then turned his rhetorical fire on my sister, and the disastrous Odyssey expansion project, spearheaded by VP Clara Sterling, resulted in a documented loss of over $73 million, a catastrophic failure of judgment that was deliberately hidden from the board and the public. He let the charges hang in the air. The silence in the room was absolute. Clara was as white as a sheet. My mother looked as if she'd been physically slapped. The other board members avoided looking at my family, staring instead at the polished surface of the table. "My client believes this pattern of gross mismanagement, blatant nepotism, and active deceit has put the very future of this historic company at risk," Davies concluded. "Therefore, acting on their instructions, I am formally calling for a vote. A motion of no confidence in Richard Sterling, Eleanor Sterling, and Clara Sterling, and for their immediate and summary removal from their executive positions and from this board." A stunned silence fell, followed by an eruption of chaos. My father was on his feet, shouting, calling Davies a corporate pirate. But the outcome was a foregone conclusion. Davies calmly initiated the vote. One by one, the representatives for the board seats that Nemesis Capital now controlled voted aye. The family friends, seeing the undeniable shift in power, the blood in the water, quickly abandoned their loyalty to save themselves. They either abstained or quietly voted with the new majority. It was a complete and utter rout. My father slammed his fist on the table, his face a mottled, apoplectic red. "Who is this? Who is this coward hiding behind their lawyers? I demand you show your face." Davies looked down at a note, then back at the camera. A flicker of a smile touched his lips. My client anticipated this request. They would like to address the board directly. His image on the screen blinked out. For a second, the screen was black. Then, it was filled with my own face. I had made sure the lighting in my office was perfect, the camera angle flattering but authoritative. My expression was calm, my eyes cold and unblinking. The collective gasp in the room was a physical thing, a sharp, unified intake of breath. My mother's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes wide with horrified disbelief. Clara stared, her jaw slack, her face a mask of dawning, nightmarish comprehension. But my father? The look on his face was something I knew I would treasure for the rest of my life. It was not just shock. It was the catastrophic, system-crashing implosion of his entire worldview. It was the look of a king discovering that the quiet kitchen maid he never knew existed was now the one leading the revolution. I let the silent, agonizing moments stretch out, savoring their shock. Then I spoke, my voice clear and steady, amplified by the boardroom's state-of-the-art speaker system. "Hello, Father, Mother, Clara." My father found his voice first, though it was just a strangled, broken whisper. "Anya, no, it's not. It can't be possible." "Oh, it's very possible," I said, a small, cold smile finally touching my lips. "It's what happens when you discard someone and assume they'll just disappear into the background. You told me I'd never amount to anything. You told me I wasn't cut out for the real world. You told me my fascination with numbers was a pointless, abstract hobby." I leaned forward into the camera, my eyes boring into theirs across the miles. "Well, that pointless hobby just bought your company. That data entry clerk you so enjoyed mocking is now your boss. I looked at each of them in turn, my voice ablade. Clara, your $73 million mistake was so poorly managed that it made the company's debt incredibly cheap to acquire. So, thank you for that. Mother, your ambiguous accounting was a perfect, detailed roadmap to every financial weakness and vulnerability in this firm. And Father, your monumental arrogance was the greatest gift of all. You were so blinded by your own reflection, so convinced of your own brilliance, you never for a second thought to look over your shoulder at the person you considered to be nothing. I straightened up in my chair, my voice losing its conversational tone and hardening into the unmistakable register of command. The vote is final. You are all removed from your positions, effective immediately. Your corporate accounts have been frozen. Your access to this building and all other company properties is revoked. Security is waiting outside this room to escort you from the premises. You will be allowed to collect your personal belongings from your offices under their direct supervision. I paused, letting the finality of the execution sink in. You said I'd never amount to anything. In a way, you were right. I didn't become anything. I became everything. Specifically, the person who gets to fire you all. With that, I clicked end call. The screen went black, leaving them alone with their ruin in the silent, stunned boardroom, under the unforgiving gaze of their ancestors. 6 months later, I sat at the head of that same mahogany table, in the custom-made leather chair my father had once occupied. The company was no longer Sterling Innovations. One of my first acts as chairwoman of the board had been to rebrand it. It was now Phoenix Industries, a name chosen to signify its dramatic and decisive rebirth from the ashes of my family's mismanagement. The stuffy, judgmental portraits of my ancestors had been removed, replaced with vibrant, modern art that spoke of the future, not the past. The business was not just surviving, it was thriving. I had ruthlessly streamlined operations, slashing the bloated executive layer my father had built to reward his cronies. I had invested heavily in the research and development he had starved of funds, and I had brought in a new, brilliant management team, a diverse group of men and women hired for their extraordinary talent, not their last name. Profits were up 40% in just 2 quarters, and our stock price had hit an all-time high. I rarely thought of them anymore. They were ghosts from a past life. The last I had heard, through the business world's ever-active grapevine, my father had attempted to start a consulting firm, but his reputation was in tatters. The public nature of his ousting, led by his own forgotten daughter, had made him a laughingstock. The firm failed within months. He was a broken man, a cautionary tale whispered about at country clubs. My mother, stripped of her social standing and her identity as the sterling matriarch, had retreated from public life entirely, a recluse in a rented condo. And Clara's fate was perhaps the most deliciously ironic. She was unemployable. No reputable firm in the country would touch the woman responsible for the Odyssey debacle, a failure now legendary in business schools. Her Wharton MBA was worthless. Her trust fund, which I discovered had been invested almost entirely in company stock, had been all but wiped out. 2 weeks ago, a colleague mentioned seeing her working at a high-end boutique on Madison Avenue, not as a customer, but as a sales associate, folding sweaters with a look of thunderous rage on her face. Someone, it seemed, still had to pour the coffee. They had lost everything: the company, the fortune, the sprawling manor which had been a corporate asset, and the social standing they valued above all else. One afternoon, a thick, cream-colored envelope, addressed in my mother's elegant, looping script, arrived at my office. I didn't open it. I saw no reason to engage with the past. I simply handed it to my executive assistant and said, "Return to sender, address unknown." My victory was not just financial, it was existential. I had not only survived their judgment, but I had used its memory as fuel to propel myself to a height they could have never imagined. They had tried to write my story, to confine me to a small, dark room of their own making, but I had broken out and written my own epic. Sitting in my office high above the city, watching the lights twinkle to life as evening fell, I felt a profound sense of peace. The anger, the resentment, the years of feeling invisible. It was all gone, replaced by the quiet, unshakable confidence of a woman who had built her own throne. They had given me nothing, and in doing so, they had given me the motivation to take everything. Justice, I had learned, was not a gift. It was a hostile takeover.